more importantly, what was the, how could a man like Carl Weiss do that? I just can't get past that. On the day before, the same Saturday that Governor Moody was putting together the case, Carl Weiss was next door at his neighbor's. And this came to me later. In fact, I'll back up. I was doing a book signing in a bookstore, and a fellow came up and he said, you wrote Huey Long book. I said, yes. He said, I got a story to tell you, and I get a lot of those, and most of them are just way off now. Here I go again. He said, my grandfather was a good friend of Carl Weiss's and lived next door to him. My grandfather was an optometrist, so and Weiss was an eye, ear, nose specialist, so they had practices together. He was the first optometrist in Baton Rouge. And he had a workshop out back where he made furniture. Well, Carl would come over and use his workshop. And on that Saturday, Carl was working on a crib for his baby boy. And the next day, allegedly, he shot Huey Long. So my question is, how could a man who's so religious and such a good family man, do this? So it just doesn't fit. It's funny. Several months after the book was published, I taught, and I was tired, and felt bad, and I went home early, and I just laid down, and the phone rang. And so there's this Dr. White who wrote Kingfish, and I said, yes, and he said, well, you'll recognize the name. My name is Carl Weiss, Jr. He was the baby. And by then he's in his 70s. He also is a very successful surgeon in New York City, has a mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. His son's a surgeon. Carl Weiss's father had been a surgeon, so that's 4 generations. He said, but anyway, Carl Weiss Jr. said he just read the book. He said it was, he loved it. He had problems with T. Harry's book. He felt T. Harry was too apologetic to Huey, and there's some baggage there. But you have to understand when T. Harry Williams wrote his book, when I wrote mine. But Carl Weiss Jr. really liked it. He felt it was very balanced. In fact, the Long family really attacked me. They said I wasn't fair and balanced. Well, this ain't Fox News. Life is not fair and balanced. Sometimes the scorecard is, gets negative. I mean, Huey did some good things, but he did some disastrous things. He was the first, probably the only dictator in this country. But they couldn't take. So anyway, Carl Weiss Jr. is talking to me about how much he liked the book, and we went through a lot of it. Finally, I said, were you aware that your father was building a crib the day before you were shot? He said, oh, no, I've never heard that. His mother, they moved to Paris to get out of the country for a while. But they eventually came back to Baton Rouge. She came back to LSU, got a master's. She was a brilliant woman in her own sense. But he was taken to Paris. Didn't learn English until he arrived at Columbia Med School years later. But he said no, and he got very quiet when I told him about the crib. And it was very poignant. I asked the guy who told me about the crib, what happened to it? He said, well, we threw it out when the grandparents had to move out of the house, and they tore down that whole section of Baton Rouge and put it in an interstate through there, everything else. But I continued to get stories. I could write a book about the book. He was very haunting. I would be buried in the state archives in the evening, and I'd walk out the door, and it's right across from the state capitol. And I'd be beat. My eyes are spinning. You're looking at microfilm for hours on end, and old newspapers covered with grit. I'd be kind of whipped, and I'd walk over to the park, and I'd sit down, and one night I did that, and I looked up, and there is Huey's statue in the mausoleum. Anybody who's been to Baton Rouge. but he's not facing the park. The statue's reversed. He's facing the Capitol. He's still in charge. He's still giving orders. And believe me, if you've gone to the legislature in Louisiana, he's still in charge. That's it. Question? Comment? And we'll be open to all sorts.
Dr. White, you've got 20 minutes. You can ask Dr. White questions during this 20-minute period, but also be aware that he'll be on the panel with Dr. Kennedy after lunch for an hour. So if you've got questions, I'm sure he'll love to have them now, but also be mindful that he'll be on the panel.
Let me ask you questions. Could it happen today?
No.
Yes.
It can happen, but he couldn't be in his own spot.
Yes, he could.
What would it take to create a UV?
They've been in. Well, it can happen, but yeah.
Catalytic event. That's good saying.
They would have been guilty.
Catalytic event. Economic event.
Protect us from terrorism.
Yeah, we saw that event in terrorism, but
It's happening
the
now.
Patriot Act, that was serious.
It is happening.
We survived that. What would it take?
Takes money and who you
How
know.
vulnerable are we today? Are we more vulnerable now than we were in 1929?
More vulnerable because if you look at the issues that dealt with depression, you have some of those same issues. Dr. Kennedy used the idea of the great unemployment. We look at employment as the kids today based on that, but why there's such an upward unemployment. So you have some of those same cursors that's occurring presently that occurred in depression, the rates of unemployment, the issue with banking. There are so many things that are so similar, and then you have a president who's introducing, or he attempted to use more legislation for the purpose of, such as a stimulus package.
Well, why haven't we seen more huge laws? You had Bilbo in Mississippi, Heflin in Alabama during the period. They never rose to that kind of what? Is this an anomaly of history? Or are there systematic elements we can model out here?
Well, I heard what you say, Louisiana from the very beginning, was the only state, I mean, it was the only place where democracy, it went from French control to this without democracy experience. I'm thinking if you dig into that, you'll find some ingredients that may play into that led to Huey, and I'm sure it's a stretch to look at it, but that led to this setup where Huey could acquire that kind of power. And then I'm sure if we really researched it, there are probably quite a few battles that were taking place at that time that lined the
Sinclair Lewis, after Huey was killed, wrote a novel. It's one of his weaker novels, I think. I like Sinclair Lewis. It's called It Can't Happen Here. And he had a character like Huey and take over a state, but it was in the Northeast. And it just didn't work. You can't see people in Massachusetts being swept up in that really hyper-populism. Huey was a populist with a capital D. All of his rhetoric appealed to the common people. And he was excellent at that. He was the best stump speaker you could have ever imagined. His arms were flailing. He was sweating. He was talking in the vernacular